Welcome to today's episode of Talent Strategy 60. I am your friendly neighborhood talent strategy nerd, Dr. Jim, and we are in for a great episode coming off the heels of Thanksgiving. Obviously, the intent of the show is to empower talent leaders to do more with less by leveraging collective intelligence, and boy, do we have a panel of collective intelligence here. So the issue that we're going to take care of, or at least try to tackle today, is leading for the right reasons. And the topic we're going to cover is really focused on how you can actually select the right leaders within your organization and build leadership bench strength. And we're going to get into some succession planning as well. And we're joined by three fantastic panelists to advance the conversation. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation. First off, we have JD joining us. JD, welcome to the show. Tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Great, thanks to be here. I think I'm included to bring down that collective level intelligence, if anything, but I'll do my best. My name is JD, living out here in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm pretty much the definition of a career Silicon Valley startup operator. Spent really my whole career, the vast majority of it at least, in tech startups, primarily in the software as a service or SaaS space. Started my career, kind of came up in the product management, product marketing realms. Later transitioned as I became much more of a senior leader and into executive roles in marketing and kind of broader go-to-market functions. I've been fortunate to work at some awesome companies that maybe some folks out there have heard of, companies like Marketo, Zendesk, Trello, Culture Amp. And I'm currently the chief revenue officer at a company called Mathison. We're a small, scrappy startup. We're focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're all about building an all-in-one platform to help people build more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplaces. So that's what I'm currently up to. And yeah, excited to be here. Love talking about this type of topic.
Awesome stuff, JD. Thanks for joining us. And, obviously you and I are both part of organizations that are advancing DEI-B. So it's great to have you advancing the cause as well. One thing that I'm curious about now, you mentioned, and hopefully this will come out in the course of the conversation, you spent a lot of your career in startup environments. So when you're thinking about building a leadership culture within startup environments, how might that show up a little bit differently than your more mature organizations?
Wow, that's a really, really good question off the bat. I think one is just the numbers game alone, right? Like dealing with much smaller numbers, different size of population, that alone can, I guess, present certain challenges and certain opportunities. I think the challenge is in that you're sort of working from a smaller bench or a smaller population to particularly choose from. Opportunity side, though, I think within startups, there's actually potentially even more opportunity to take on leadership roles or to step into leadership roles that might be harder in a more established organization that's got certain hierarchy or rules or ways of advancing, where I think oftentimes in a startup, and one of the great things I love about it is there's just a lot of room to sort of grab the bull by the horns, if you will, and just kind of start leading and just start attacking things kind of from that perspective. So that's something that comes to mind.
Yeah, great insights, and obviously I have an affinity for startup and accelerating growth stage organizations because that's been the space that I've been in. And if we're talking about folks that are on the panel that are probably 180 degrees apart from you and I, JD, we have Josh joining us on the show. Josh, welcome to the show, and tell us a little bit about yourself as well as the kind of work that you've been doing.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. I've been working at QB Insurance for 15 years now, and I've had a variety of leadership roles throughout my time. Currently, I'm focused on leading a global team, which is primarily done from my home in southeastern Wisconsin, a little bit different than the Bay Area. Pretty cold here today. But I think the biggest achievement that I've had in the 15 years at QB is moving from a technical, very hands-on role to becoming a leader and leading global teams, leading functional areas across different regions. That's been really great. It's one of my biggest passions is working with people and everything that comes with it. We'll kind of get into some of those things with leadership today, right? But I think one of the biggest things that I really focus on with my teams is finding balance. I do that for myself. I encourage people to do that themselves, especially when you work with global teams in different time zones. I do a lot of running, not like you, Dr. Jim. I'm not running as far as you. I'm doing it for exercise. I have to say it because if you look at me, you wonder maybe, I don't know. But this year or next year, I should say October, I'm trying to set out to hike the Grand Canyon rim to rim, mix it up a little bit, make it a little bit different. But ultimately, it's spending time with family helps me find some balance there too.
Awesome stuff, Josh. And I don't know if I'm going to put up my running skills up against anybody because my running is more like a duck waddle than anything else. So it is what it is. But one thing that I was curious about right off the bat, we have some really interesting contrasts between the backgrounds that JD and I come from, and then you're at a global insurance company. And you're in tech. So one of the things that I'm curious about is, in general, when you're thinking about leadership challenges or navigating leadership within a technical sphere, and certainly you have your own nuances with being in the insurance space, what are some of the things that you've grappled with and overcome as you went through your 15 years at QBE?
I think the biggest thing, and maybe I have the blinders on, maybe this isn't specific to tech, but I do think that oftentimes the highest performers, the people that know the most, the people that have the best hands-on capabilities tend to get into management, leader, or leadership roles, and it's not always a right fit. And I think we can definitely touch on a bit more of that as we go through some of the topics here today. But it's not really insurance specific, but it definitely is something that I think is presented a lot of challenges. A lot of times you get that individual contributor who thinks that they can come forward and do more of the individual contributor stuff while telling people to do stuff. And that definitely has some fallout.
Great insights. And we're definitely going to be getting into some of that conversation because, I've obviously been in the sales function more often than not. And those same patterns tend to pop up in that world as well. So I think it's going to be pretty interesting to dig deep into these areas and kind of reset the ship. So last but certainly not least, we have fellow Uber nerd, and I label anybody that has a terminal degree an Uber nerd versus just a garden variety nerd. So Dr. Courtney Peagram, welcome to the show. Tell the audience a little bit about yourself and the work that you've been doing, and we'll dive into the conversation from there.
Well, thank you. It's the first time I've been called an Uber nerd. I'll take that. I'm more like a scatterbrain. So I am a professor at Elmhurst University. Big shout out to Elmhurst. Woo! And I am a business psychologist. So I am a business psychologist in the School of Business. So what I bring to the table is emotional intelligence, and it's all about feelings. I'm a coach consultant, and then I've ran a lot of leadership training development and mentorship programs for corporate. So I'm more like an external consultant that came in. So prior to being to Elmhurst, I ran my company, and I still do some consulting on the side to stay relevant, right? Because things change, just how leadership evolves. So that's a little bit about me.
No, I think you're kind of truncating all of your experience. So I'm gonna toss it right back to you. I really like the fact that you are heavily involved in the EQ space, and one of the things that commonly comes up in conversations about leadership is when you have first time leaders, there is often a mistake that they make when they're focusing on the technical end of it. So if you're advising first-time leaders on how to set themselves up for success, tell us a little bit about the role that EQ plays in positioning for team success if you're a first-time leader.
Well, it all comes down to self-awareness. If you don't know who you are, it's really hard to lead others, to influence, to persuade people to do things. So I always like to go back to, what are your strengths? Where is one weakness that's holding you back? And how do you communicate and interact with others? And then you evaluate that as an individual perspective, and then you build out to social awareness. What is the culture of your organization? What are the key components? How do we achieve goal alignment? So it comes from self-awareness and then to social awareness.
Great stuff, and I think that aspect of self-awareness is absolutely critical for leadership success. So I'm looking forward to getting more of your insights on that particular line of thought. Before we dive into the conversation, I want to just thank everybody that's joining us on the stream. Keep in mind, this is an interactive conversation. So you have 3 heavy hitters on this panel from the startup world, from the global insurance world, from the higher education world, with a lot of experience that they're bringing to the table. So certainly if there are questions that you want answered that we can support you with, definitely drop that in the chat so that we can engage those as well. So let's set the landscape a little bit and dive into the conversation. And I think the three of the panelists have done a fantastic job of laying out some of the things that they've seen. But I think it's pretty obvious for anybody that's been in leadership that the job is very difficult. And oftentimes, Josh, you mentioned this happening a lot. It's your high performers that typically get selected into leadership because logically, or at least illogically, somebody thought that's a great idea. And oftentimes what happens is that when you're cast into that leadership role, especially as a first-time leader, you're not really supported in any meaningful way in terms of, well, how do you lead? How are you supposed to move from a granular individual contributor to somebody that has responsibilities for an entire team? And how do you get that team moving in the right direction? So it's one of those situations where you're completely at the quote unquote mercy of somebody else. You're no longer in control. And that creates a lot of stress. It creates a lot of firefighting syndrome. And oftentimes with your highly technical or capable producers, they often will drill themselves back down into the production role and, in some ways, kneecap the development of their team by doing that. And there's a whole host of problems that are associated with it. And when we're looking at, an end-to-end solution or if we're looking at creating an environment where we're making our leaders more effective, there's a lot of runway that we can take and put into place to solve those issues. So when we're looking at first-time leaders, the challenges that they encounter, organizations in terms of setting up their leaders for success, what have been your observations when it comes to how closely is what I've described been consistent with what you've seen? And I think I'm going to hand that question off to JD and have JD respond from the startup lens. How have you seen this show up in the startup world?
Seen it show up a lot. And even when we were sort of first talking about having this conversation, right around that same time, in fact, I remember seeing a tweet out on Twitter, that thing that still survives, I guess, or whatever. But saw a tweet from like a very prominent venture capitalist in the tech world who very specifically called out that like his belief was you should find your best engineer and put him in charge of engineering. And like just went all in on that sort of thought concept. And I remember when I saw that, just having like this almost violent reaction to the opposite of that, knowing that just even in my own head, thinking about some of the most brilliant engineers that I've worked with in my time, but knowing that many of them were not qualified, maybe didn't even want, frankly, to be in leadership or to be in management. And a lot of, it's just this idea that top performer equals, leader or manager that I think is so misplaced. And I think it's why, we've often had, a lot of issues, I guess, within companies, maybe being as effective or as efficient as we can. So yeah, definitely like the topic resonates with me and I see it all the time. I do think it tends to show up a little bit more in those sort of technical types of positions and roles, although the sales example that you mentioned, Dr. Jim, I think is another one where I've seen that a lot. I think there are other areas of the business where it maybe not quite as common, but I think definitely, like I said, engineering, technical positions, things like that, sales have seen it as well. The thing that interests me, and I'd love to get the opinions of other folks on the panel about this, is while maybe we're all agreeing, because I saw the nodding heads, that just simply being the top performer doesn't necessarily equal that you should be a leader or a manager of the team. But I do wonder people's perspectives here on like but how much knowledge of that particular area of the business, how much experience, how much high performance do you need to be able to step in that? Meaning, I probably wouldn't be the right choice, even though I have a lot of management experience, a lot of leadership experience, may not work to go suddenly drop me to run engineering, right? Because I haven't been an engineer. I haven't actually pushed lines of code. I haven't done that thing. I'm curious, some others on the panel, like, where is that line? Like, how much high performance, how much expertise in the area do you need? And you know, as in sales, for example, and I can maybe later share some personal experience where I did actually have to drop into a sales leadership at one point in my career without carrying the bag or actually having been a salesperson. And there were a lot of challenges in that, but I'm curious what others think about, like, where is that line? Like, you know.
Yeah. I really like that question, and it's got my wheels turning, and I'll open it up to either Josh or Doc, Dr. Courtney, to chime in, whoever wants to go first. That's a really interesting question. Where is the line between having lived the life and then being able to lead versus not having lived the life and then being put into leadership? What are your observations or opinions on that? Doc, you want to tackle this one first?
Sure. So let me take a stab at this. So I think it's always a depend, right? There's not one size fits all. However, I think that a good leader will always learn. So you can always learn new skills, knowledge, and you'll build on your leadership skills, but it takes a certain skill set to be able to lead a group, right? So I can get the best people that surrounds me that know coding, that know like tech, and they can help me make the decisions that are technical, but I'm able to then empower them and help them set to achieve what is out there, right? So I think at that point, it has to be a mix or match. But I think that if you're a transformational leader, right, a servant leader, those type of leaders like want to learn from the ground up and understand everything, and they'll get the best people in place to help them so they can lead their team. And I want to kind of pivot but come back to this. One of the things that I've noticed is the way we're onboarding new leaders right now is just a mess. And I think that's a challenge too, is like a leader will walk in, not understand the culture, not understand key aspects of the organization. So it's hard to lead someone in that point.
You know, those are really good points, and I know that we're going to get to the onboarding part of the conversation later on in the discussion. But I want to get Josh's input on the question that JD asked, because I've seen it where some in sales, some of your best leaders, and actually more often than not, your best leaders aren't from the highest of the high production route. In sales, I've seen a ton of fantastic leaders who are solid producers, but that's not really what they what they focused on. And I've seen similar things in IT as well, where you have some phenomenal leaders that come out of project management or some other non-technical function that take over a technical team and have done well. And actually, one of the folks who is a VP of engineering at Carta, Preeti Kaur, kind of came from a similar background, where one of the first things that she told her team was, "Hey, I've been through the ranks, but my job as a leader isn't to compete with you on my ability to code. That's what you're here for." What have you seen in terms of that fine line between having lived the life or not, and how that translates into leadership effectiveness?
It's good. It's a good question. I've lived a little bit of that through my roles that I've had at QB, where I've been put on in a leadership capacity with a team where, while I have IT skills and I have context, I don't have, like, I was never this person. I never managed or was an administrator of this thing. And seeing some of the comments here, I think it really speaks to the right approach in a situation like that is, don't come in thinking that you know everything and you're going to call all the shots. You have people that are on that team that have a job, like you say. You're not going to push the code, right, JD? You have people that know how to do that. They're expert there. Lean on them. Focus on what the output needs to be. Come together and have humility. If you don't know something, ask it, learn. Learning as a leader, it's a continual thing.
So it's interesting. So we've seen in the chat, so Mark Cunningham and Abha Malia have both echoed similar elements of what we've just been talking about, which is, hey, if you want to be successful as a leader, it's not a requirement that you come in and be the smartest person in the room. So those are some brilliant call outs from the audience, and it mirrors kind of what everyone on the panel has said. So let's advance that part of the conversation a little bit and start at the beginning. We've all hit at certain elements of, hey, some of the process for selecting leadership or selecting leaders within the organization is just fundamentally broken. So if we're solving for that problem, and I want to have Josh field this question first. How do we fix the selection process when it comes to, advancing somebody into a leadership role? What are the things that you've seen work really well, and what are some of the pitfalls?
So I'm a huge Simon Sinek fan. One of the segments he has, it really talks about whether or not people, so everyone has the capacity to lead, but is now the right time, or do they want to? And sometimes it's your circumstance and where you're in life, or maybe you just don't feel like you're going to be the right fit. Again, I'm going back to, if you're going to build a bench. So the biggest thing that I think needs to happen and doesn't happen often enough is cultivating the skill sets, understanding who has a desire to become a leader and why. Because here's the thing: if you have someone who wants to be a leader because it's more money, pump the brakes. There's a caution flag out there. Really make sure that they understand it's a different job. You have to really go at it with empathy, caring for people. You get the team you get. It's kind of like family, right? You don't get to pick them sometimes, and you're going to have to work with those folks. But as you dig in and you understand what their career aspirations are, and you start to unpick some of the capabilities that people have, different qualities like self-awareness, the EQ side of things, and giving them some opportunities to get some exposure. That's when you can start to find where you might have some of that talent in-house in building the bench, or understanding that maybe it's 3 to 5 years out for some of these folks, and if you have an immediate need, you're going to have to look external. But don't wait until it's time for you to fill the role.
I think your point, Josh, about don't wait until it's time for you to fill the role to actually start the process. That's a really good point that you brought up. I think when you're looking at selecting leaders or building your bench, there's a lot of runway that we could take from there. I think one of the things that I want to ask Dr. Pegram about this is, how do you navigate a scenario where you have somebody that, aspires to be in leadership, but they also like to be on the front line, kind of like a player coach? And, for those that know me, I'm basically describing sort of my issue is that, and this is what makes me great at a startup or accelerating growth organization, is that I can't be purely strategic or managerial. I like being shoulder to shoulder up front. So how do you, from your perspective, Doc, how would you navigate progression for that sort of profile when you're selecting for the right leader?
So I'm smiling because that's me. Hi. Yeah. So in running my company, I was always on the ground, right? I could never get higher level to strategy. I give great inspirational speech and be with my employees, but I could never kind of the scalability, right? When it comes to leadership. So what I would say, and this is just my theory, is it takes different leaders at different stages of the organization. And find your strike zone. You might be really good at startups and getting everyone off the ground, but maybe you need to pass the torch over when you get to the next step. I don't know. How does that ring?
No, I think that's a really good point. And there's an article, and I forgot the author, so bad nerd credentials on my part. But there's an article that was written by one of the early stage leaders in Facebook, and it was called "Letting Go of Your Legos," and it speaks directly to your point, Doc, about, hey, you have to learn when to let go. So my question, I'm going to throw that to JD. JD, if you're a person who likes, like Courtney and I, being in the trenches and being side by side, how have you coached people to let go of their Legos so that they have a bigger role? Like what are some of the things that you've done in those organizational shifts?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, and I don't know if there's any magic answer. And I love the Legos thing too. I've used that a lot, like internally, like, and actually that's one of the strategies, right? Is just naming it, calling it what it is, and actually using language like that, like having those moments. I've had those direct moments with direct reports who are managers or leaders, where I've had to like literally use that terminology and call it like, are you just hanging on to your Legos there? Or, and so I think some of it is just being upfront and giving it a name, giving it a label, and calling what it is. But yeah, it's an ongoing challenge. I think the other thing that comes to my mind is just constantly like staying focused and providing that clarity on what are the primary objectives of this role that we're asking you to do. And I think if you really stay grounded and you stay very aligned and clear with the person on what those objectives are, it's a little bit easier for them to, sort of fall into the right patterns of driving those things and knowing they're going to need others to drive those. I did want to go back to the question with just a couple other things in terms of the selection piece. Following up on what Josh said, and I'll misquote him, but something about you've got to start the process earlier before you actually need it when you're selecting a leader. I see so often people make the mistake of, it's like, you're an individual contributor one day, here's a promotion to manager, go have fun. And I think simple, like, you've got to crawl, walk, run with these things. And I think giving people opportunities to lead prior to having a formal title change or putting someone in a manager role, I think is critical, whether that's leading on a project, whether that's, leading a small group, or even taking on a sort of, lead role before an official manager role, like those sorts of things, that trial by fire, right? Giving people the opportunity to demonstrate leadership and working with them on that before it's sort of a formalized thing or a full-on job change. The other thing I just want to make sure and throw out, I'd be remiss if I didn't, is we all have biases. And there's a lot of great research and a lot of great reading you can do on biases. And I think recognizing and understanding those biases going into leadership selection, critically important. And there's like obvious biases that jump to people's mind, certain types of discrimination, things like that. But some of maybe the lesser talked about biases that I think come directly into play with something like selecting and grooming future leaders is recency bias, proximity bias, things like that, right? It's often, hey, now I'm in this position, hey, I've got to hire a new manager, someone left. And there's a natural occurrence to think of just what's happened in the last few weeks. Like who's been stepping up and leading last few weeks. But sometimes you got to step back and really look at a longer time frame and not just be so caught up in what happened yesterday or this morning or that sort of thing. And proximity too. We all as humans have this natural tendency to, gravitate towards the people we're closest to, literally physically, but it may just also be who do you have the most Zoom meetings with? You're seeing them all the time. You're likely to potentially bias and think more favorably of them versus someone maybe you're not seeing and interacting with on a regular basis. So I think calling and understanding, similar to the thing about the Legos, like labeling it, thinking about it, be conscious about that as you go in, I think can help you make better decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think, JD, there are a lot of great points that you just made, and I love that you called out, recognizing your biases in the process, not falling into the trap of who do you work most closely with, and then, kind of thumbing the scale in their favor. I think there's an entire conversation about how organizationally you could structure, a high potential program to factor out those criteria and create that progression that Josh was talking about. But one of the things that you opened the door for, JD, and I want to pose this to Dr. Pegram, is the idea of how are we preparing leaders to lead? How are we being proactive about it? And Doc, you mentioned this early in the conversation. The way that we onboard leaders is fundamentally broken. So what I'd like you to kind of share is how are things in terms of leadership onboarding broken? And then what are the things that should be done to unbreak them? Or what are the things that can be done to like structure them properly so that we're actually positioning leaders to be successful versus just throwing them into the fire?
So I think there's a few things. So I'm based off, I did a ton of, I'm currently working on publishing some research on post-COVID, how leadership changed, right? And the main things that I think is critical is leaders need to continually develop their interpersonal skills, their active listening skills, their ability to show compassion. And throughout the research, it's all about authenticity and building psychological safety, right? So we need to build trust and foster that because trust can be easily broken, right? We saw that during the pandemic where everything changed in a moment and it created fear and uncertainty, and leaders weren't trained for that necessarily. Or how do I change my work environment, my people and everything? So it's training on uncertainty, transition, change, but that emotional intelligence piece is critical, and everyone needs to work on it every day. So that's how we develop our leaders.
So I have a follow-up on that, and I want to make sure that JD and Josh have a chance to chime in on the original question. Courtney, Dr. Pegram, you mentioned everybody's got to work on emotional intelligence. I think one of the things that's interesting from the private sector side is that that's a coaching function. And when you look at working on those softer skills, which I think are critical skills, that's generally not available for your first-time managers. So how do we bridge that gap where your first-time managers actually, that's where they need it most, right? How do you make that transition from being a technical expert or a SME to a people leader and coach them up in that respect? So what are some of the things that you've seen that are really effective in getting those first-time managers more effective, more tuned into their EQ requirements of the job?
So it's about how you deliver the information first, right? So let's take the word soft skills and let's scratch that, because the minute we hear soft skills, we think, oh, fluffy, like feelings, emotions. Well, emotions drive our thoughts and behaviors. So if we don't take in consideration emotions, then we can't function, right? Because we feel all the time. So if we take out that part and we replace it with ideas of understanding how to be emotionally literate and manage emotions, then we can empower first-time leaders to get the job done. If you show the value of the return on the investment by demonstrating the impact of training on emotional intelligence, then you create buy-in. And when people buy in, they're more likely to then do the things to create those changes. So changing the language from emotional literacy to emotional management and understanding that will have impact on your employees' behaviors, increase performance, and employee retention.
So oh man, there's like 6 shows that you just cited off, Doc. So I'm trying to be as focused as I can. Sticking with the theme of EQ, and I want to get Josh's perspective on it. We've talked about, how do you effectively onboard leaders, and Dr. Pegram mentioned the importance of EQ. That's kind of tough in a highly technical functional group. That's not natural, and I'm speaking in broad terms, and I probably shouldn't. But within the IT world, that's tough to navigate. So what have you seen? What have you done to help bridge that gap as a people leader in your world?
Yeah, that's a fair point. And there's definitely stereotypes that IT people are introverts and all that. Not totally untrue, but I think one of the biggest things that will help anybody, and anybody who wants to be a leader or is a leader, and you don't have this available at your company, just go online, get a communication style assessment, understand how you communicate and how kind of understand how others are communicating with you. And then it's somebody had said something about being adaptable, right? Adapting to that communication style. And I think that if you have self-awareness and you understand a little bit more about yourself, a lot of times people who report to me will hear me talk about, look yourself in the mirror. you know with the situation, could you have approached it differently? What could you do next time? If you understand your communication style, that goes a long way, and a lot of the things that Courtney was talking about definitely start to kind of fall into place because you're more in tune with what's going on, you're thinking about things a bit differently. But aside from sending somebody to training as opposed to the hey, you're a manager, congratulations, have fun, you know make sure as a leader or as someone who is becoming a leader that there's one-to-one time and there's time spent to make sure that the objectives, I think JD you mentioned earlier, are there. I have a friend, he does leadership coaching, Andy Maris. He says to be unclear is to be unkind. I think that speaks volumes.
You mentioned something, Josh, that I really like, and you just kind of walked us through a little bit, and you tied it to one-on-ones that leaders should be having with their people. And it was the questions that you were asking. Well, what do you think? Why did you do this? Why did you take that approach? Or have you thought about this? I really like that. And I want to hand that off to JD. Talk either about any of the stuff that we've covered so far in terms of how leaders can be more effectively onboarded, or tie that into the value of questions as a leader when you're engaging with your team as a way to drive leadership effectiveness. Tell us about what you've seen across any of that.
Yeah, three things: feedback, feedback, feedback. Oh, I guess that's actually one thing, but feedback. Yeah, when you brought up the questions, even before you said that, to me, something that just kept coming to my mind is this is a constant exercise. It never ends, right? You can put people in the best onboarding, the best training programs ever, but once they walk out of those rooms, it's easy for that to fade. It's easy for that to die over time. And I think feedback, like constant feedback loops. And I think feedback starts with questions, actually, much more than it does telling someone, hey, do this differently, or giving them feedback in that way. I think a lot of it starts and should be rooted in asking good questions and listening. And sometimes it's not even so much what the question is you're asking, it's the fact you're asking a question, right? Tying back to that EQ thing. It's the fact that it's showing the person on the other end that you care. Kind of related to that, and you got me thinking about it when Josh mentioned like doing those like communication assessments. What's your communication style or your learning style? And I'm a big fan of those. Something I've used in the past that's been pretty effective is having people create effectively their own user manual. Hey, this is who I am. This is the way I like to be communicated to, those sorts of things. And again, much like my comment on questions, even just the exercise of doing that shows people that you care, that you're not putting everybody in the same box. You're understanding that these are all individuals on the team, and you may need to work with them, lead them, support them differently. So yeah, but for me, it all roots back to making sure you've got a feedback loop, and it's constant and ongoing.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit. So I get the value. Actually, I just Doc, you had something that you wanted to respond to JD on. So I want to yield the floor and let you have at it.
Yeah, and I wonder if it's so. Just from what I've seen in training and also the current research, I think when we came back to like the new normal of things, a lot of times leaders are afraid to give feedback because I find that they were afraid to give feedback, or they waited too late, or they just felt like, it wasn't that big of a deal. We'll wait till the performance appraisal or the performance evaluation, which is the worst, right? So there's a fear now in like mostly like new time managers giving feedback, right? And then there's the other house that is like, I'm just going to be honest and tell you how it is. And it's so harsh. and it's targeted, that people aren't receiving it. Like, so there's two kind of trains of thought with that. And I think it's important to say there's a fear of giving feedback. And then there's the people that just like say whatever they want. Like, well, I'm just giving you feedback, or, you know, and that has an impact on how people receive it and leadership.
I love what you just said there, Doc, and I want to hand this right back to you. You mentioned, hey, there's two schools of thought. There's the, hey, let's wait it out. It's not that big a deal. We'll do it in the appraisals or performance reviews. And then there's the other thought where you're going to be, or the other camp where you're going to be feedback almost on a near constant basis. But that creates a couple of issues. And you know, personally, I would rather err on the side of having too much feedback than not enough. But the question that I have for the panel, and I want Doc, you to take the first stab at it. What are the things that you should be doing as a new or experienced leader to create the space and the safety for that feedback? Because just like what you said, if I'm getting feedback and let's say JD and I are working together and we don't have a relationship and he tells me something, I'm probably going to be like, what's the agenda here? What are you trying to get at? So what are the things that leaders should be doing to create the space for that feedback to be received the right way?
So I love this question. So first, building psychological safety, right? Having a trusting environment. Then second is modeling it, right? So asking for feedback. So always asking, then sharing. And I used to do this with my employees too. I'd be like, hey, so here's where I could have improved. Here's the things that I didn't do, right? And then like by modeling the behavior, it opened up the door of how you want to receive feedback, how to give it, and creates that safer place for people to take risks to give feedback and then receive it. And also, I mean, there's really critical points of like, you never criticize in public, right? So praise in public, criticize in private is really important. And lastly, what I've noticed in some of the findings is it's about personality style. So you have introverted, extroverted, but addressing that personality to mold the feedback so it's received.
Great stuff, and I appreciate your insight there. Josh, what do you have to add to that? What are the things that you've seen work well in terms of creating that space?
It's spending time and getting to know people as an individual. And to your point, you know, if you're going to have that safety, it's because you've developed a working relationship with a person. You understand who they are. You don't just only talk to them when you're giving feedback or something's gone awry. Yeah, have those one-to-ones. Make sure that you have team meetings, individual meetings, and you keep them. Don't keep canceling them or pushing them out, because that erodes trust. When you can establish trust, you open things up to having that safety to have those conversations. And a lot of times, you know, JD, I think you had said something like just asking the question. Sometimes it opens it up, and if there's trust and there's safety there, you can have some really good conversations, and people open up about how they truly feel about something or where they might feel that they need some additional support.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Josh. I want to put a little tweak on that same question to you, JD. You know, both Dr. Peagram and Josh have been talking about, you know, creating the time, making the time, you know, kind of labeling things and delivering it appropriate to the audience that's receiving the message. You and I are both from fast-paced startup worlds, and oftentimes we might fall into the trap of thinking, oh, we don't have time for all of that, you know, nuance. We got to get stuff done. How do you balance those two competing interests and still create the space effectively to have the conversations that you need to have?
It's a tough one, and I would be completely not truthful if I sat here and told you, oh, I nailed it. Here's the blueprint. I mean, if there's anybody who's ever worked for me on the thread, they're probably leaning in. Yeah, JD, how did because it's tough. Like, there's no doubt about it. When you know, business is moving fast and things are moving fast, it's tough. But a couple things I think about is, one, the sacredness of the one-on-one space. Never canceling, doing your best to never be late, always just sort of keeping that as a sacred thing, no matter what, you know, on kind of your calendar. I think that's like, it sounds small, but I think that's a really big thing, right? To build that trust, to build that, you know, that you care kind of zone, I think with your people. So I think certain things like that, just making them mandatory and making sure you do hold the space despite what's going on. I think within that too, I try to, and I say try because again, this is a hard one to keep to, of having that rhythm where, hey, a lot of our one-on-ones are going to be fairly tactical. We're going to be moving fast through things that are happening that week. But let's make sure and carve out every 3 or every 4 or whatever it is to take that session and do something different with it. I actually think about a few years ago, I had a great guy, Andy, working for me. And at a certain rhythm like that, we would do a one-on-one where we'd get out of the office, take a walk, or go to lunch and make that a pure sort of put the work aside. Let's talk a little more career conversation. Let's talk about what's going on in your life, where you're at and those sorts of things. So it's hard. Look, it's hard, but I think making the space, making that a formal thing. The other thing I'll throw in too is having, in addition to things like the performance review process, which even at a small, fast-paced startup, you probably have one of some sort that's been formalized, but finding other things you can insert into the sort of regular rhythm, like a 360 feedback review or those types of things. And I actually want to call out something that popped into my head when Dr. Peagram was talking about role modeling the behavior and asking your people for feedback about you and that sort of thing. We did a 360 process recently for our upper management layer at our company. And I was so pleased and so happy that without asking, without any prompting, 2 of my more junior leaders actually took their 360 results and went to their team and shared them and said, hey, this is what my 360 told me about me, and I want to share that with you and shit. And so, yeah, love seeing that sort of thing as well.
You mentioned a lot there that really caught my attention. I go back and forth on your point about, hey, one-on-ones, we tend to keep those pretty tactical. I've taken sort of an opposite approach where if we're talking about metrics related activities, I leave those for like the weekly or like the daily touch points. And then I reserve the one-on-ones for more open-ended conversation. And I typically tend to, what's on your mind? And I try to be disciplined in that way. I don't know if there's necessarily a right or wrong formula to it, but it caught my attention when you mentioned it. I want to stick with you, JD, as we cycle through the conversation. We've talked a little bit about how you can, select leaders more effectively, how you can position them for better results through your onboarding process. And in the course of that conversation, we've had some discussion about, what can be done differently. And I want to expand on that question in this segment of the conversation. If organizations are identifying some of the key areas that they can zone in on to better equip their leaders for success, what are the common mistakes that they should be avoiding? And I'll limit it to one per person. And JD, you've mentioned a couple, so you can't reuse those. So I'm putting you on the spot there. Question to you, what are key things that organizations should be paying attention to or common mistakes that they should avoid when it comes to tackling the problem of leadership effectiveness?
Yes, so many, and I think we have again hit on through a different angle a bunch of them. So I'll try to come up with something new here. But I've always loved the expression "iron sharpens iron," and I think that one thing we do too often, or a mistake, is again sort of leave people alone in their silo. It's like you've brought someone into a leadership position, you've brought them into maybe a management role, and now they're a little bit on their own, or they're at least just stuck in their department. They've got you, as their leader to work with. But I think just being around other leaders and fostering an environment where the new manager in engineering is getting time with the manager in sales or the manager in marketing or in another part of the company, just managers or leaders being with leaders where they can collaborate, learn from each other, or frankly, just, maybe even just have the time to vent, right? Or just to share the common problems that are experiencing. Because there is so much of leadership and management that is common, no matter what the department or the domain you're working on. And I think too often we leave these people kind of siloed and on their own. And I think about something we did recently. We had a management offsite for kind of all the managers and leaders in our company. And it's something we very consciously did was making sure we mixed up the groupings and had some small projects where people could work with their peers, but peers that they're not usually working with. right? That they're not usually interacting with, but just getting those groups of leaders to interact with leaders from other parts of the business, a lot of value, I think, in that. So finding those ways to, allow people to get with people going through the similar things that they are, and kind of breaking down the silos, I guess is another way of saying it.
I really like what you said there, in terms of, I translated that in my head as creating a cohort as part of the journey. So you select people within your organization that are at the same stage, and you get them networking across the organization to create its own organic support structure. That's really solid stuff.
Great way to
Doc,
put it.
Doc, same question to you. So if you're looking at common mistakes to avoid or key things to pay attention to, two sides of the same coin, what would be your advice?
Stop making assumptions. So in coaching some leaders that move on to the next level, I hear all the time, well, they hired me for this, I should know this. And they don't ask the questions, right? So it's like they're afraid to ask because they don't want to look incompetent. And the higher we move, even though we want to be authentic and we want to be all this, we're still afraid to fail, right? It's not something that feels good. And we have these fears of these insecurities, or we have what I like to call workplace trauma, is the stories we keep telling ourselves that kind of push us. So it's really important to not make assumptions about the leader, and also asking more questions and opening that door to be able to ask the questions that might seem obvious, but for them is not.
I really love what you said about stop making assumptions. And it's interesting how that shows up when I'm interacting with when I've led teams, because I'm pretty serious in terms of my face, and people always look at me like I'm mad about something, or if I'm like, this is my thinking face. And when people see that who don't know me, they're like, oh God, Jim's irritated as hell. So I've had to get in the habit of saying, hey, just because my forehead is creased or my eyebrows are creased or I'm doing this, it doesn't mean I'm mad. It means I'm thinking and listening to what you're saying. But just because of the optics of it, people make the assumptions that, oh, this is not hitting well. So I was chuckling as you said that. Josh, same question to you.
I'm going to take a spin off of what Dr. Pegram said. I think assumptions often aren't acknowledged as assumptions. So one of the biggest things that I think new leaders, even seasoned leaders, can make is you take something at face value and you look at it as a requirement, but you don't necessarily, it seems sketchy, but you don't ask too many questions about it. And you're going down a path where maybe you have a timeline that's set for arbitrary reasons and questions weren't asked, etc. So I'll take a spin off of that and say let's throw the flag on things that should be assumptions that we're viewing as requirements, and we're maybe positioning the team to work at breakneck speed for no good reason.
Solid stuff, everybody. I really appreciate all the insights that the three of you have brought to the table, and we've kind of breezed through this conversation. It's almost at time, but before we sign off, I want everybody to kind of do two things. So one, if you're advising any organization on building a leadership bench or improving their leadership effectiveness, what's the one key takeaway that you would give about that objective, and where can people find you? So I want to open that with Dr. Pegram. You first. Key takeaway, where can people find you?
So key takeaway is ask more questions, right? And then base those questions, and then take those questions and do something with it, right? So take the data and do something. Just don't let it sit there, right? So that promotes growth. And where can you find me? On LinkedIn. I'm super active on LinkedIn. So please connect with me. I'd love that.
Awesome. Great stuff. And thank you for joining us, Doc. Josh, same question to you.
You can't emphasize it enough. Get to know your team, cultivate whatever their aspirations are, leadership or otherwise, and make sure that you're investing in them. You can find me on LinkedIn, and I really appreciate the time.
Yeah, it was great having your insight. Thanks for sharing your wisdom and insights with us, Josh. JD, actually, I'm going to add something onto your list. So not only do you have to do a key takeaway and where people can find you. You have to grab the guitar and play a tune.
Oh, no. We're not going there. We're not going there, man. We'll really hurt the audience. We'll drop your numbers and your ratings in a hurry. But I will say, got so many action items from this. I'll give a very specific thing, and that is to go back to your organizations and talk about and be very upfront and frank about what it actually means to be a manager and what your day-to-day life is like. I'll give a quick example. I see so many times where people will be complaining about meetings. I hate meetings. We need more meetings. And then at review time, hey, I want to be a manager. It's like, dude, you got to realize as a manager, you're going to be in meetings. Like, there's no way to avoid it. So I think really being upfront and helping people understand what those roles are, I think is a big thing and a good takeaway for everybody. Similar to them, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find there, pretty frequently found there as well. I'm going to pass on the guitar thing. I'm still learning.
Aren't we all? So thanks again for everybody joining, all the panelists. I appreciate the insights that you brought to the table and the great engagement. For the folks that are watching us on the stream, really love the engagement in the comments and appreciate you joining us. We will have another show this Friday, and this is going to be on making your veterans hiring and development programs more effective. So join us this Friday at 12:30 for another show on Talent Strategy 60. But for those who have joined us and will catch this session on demand, let us know what you think. What are the questions that didn't get answered? And I'm sure that all the panelists, including myself, will be happy to respond and offer our insights. So until next time, thanks for the time. Thanks for the insights. Really looking forward to more great conversations on Talent Strategy 60.